welcome to another episode of Yalla Let's Talk. Today we're going to be talking about going from Gaza to becoming diaspora, and we have no other than Farah Qaddan with us today. Farah is a storyteller, published writer, and a creative that centers her Arab Palestinian identity and everything she does. Thank you, Farah, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really honored.
Likewise. Farah, you spent a chunk of your life in Gaza. Can you tell us what it was like growing up in Gaza?
For sure. So I was born in 1998, and this is relevant just because this was during a part or a period in time where Gaza was not only occupied, but it was also settled by the colonial entity. Growing up, even at a young age, you become very, very aware of the occupation and the really ugly realities of it, from the checkpoints to the settlements that dotted across the Gaza Strip to obviously a lot of escalations, curfews. There was always this awareness that your life is almost constantly in danger. And that was the reality that we grew up in, me and every other child, really. The year 2000 is when the second intifada happened, and I wasn't there during that time because my mom was doing her master's in the States. So I was with her during that time. But I remember even like being 2 years old, there was always this like sense of worry that followed us everywhere we went, where my mom was constantly trying to make sure that everyone back home is safe because, you know, it's our whole life that's there. It's my grandparents, my great grandparents, my cousins, aunts, uncles, our friends, our neighbors. Our entire lives are so entwined with the people there. And so this sense of othering and danger is something that you inherit as soon as you're born there. And that etches itself really deeply into your identity when you experience that growing up. So that was one side of it. The other side of growing up in Gaza was also full of a lot of joy and beautiful, warm memories. We're so full of life. And I just remember how every single person there, young and old, will always try to make the best of every situation, every Eid, every holiday celebration. Every event was always full of so much warmth and hospitality. I have endless childhood memories there that are just reminiscent of a place that, as you know, sad and tragic as it is, and the state that it had to get to, ultimately was so full of life and people who loved life too. So I'm always hold on to those memories very closely.
I love that. I love how you both articulated that there was this sense of fear growing up. You know, you're living under an occupation.
Yeah.
At the same time, what people tend to forget is Palestinians love life, and there is joy and there are memories that are created. And just on that misconception,
Mm-hmm.
what is something you wish people knew about the people of Gaza?
I think common themes that often come out is that when people think of Gaza, they think of resilience and they think of survivors. And although both of those things are very true, at the core of it is that we are lovers. We love life. We're not meant to be living under such horrific circumstances. We're not supposed to. This is not normal. It shouldn't be normal. What we endure is a byproduct of the love that we have for ourselves, for our families, our loved ones. The way we have so much care for our community and our people and our land, it's always reflected in the stories that you see, the videos that you see, and the different things that you hear about that are emerging from there. It's why you're able to see people who are living under the most horrific conditions with this ongoing genocide, and they're still able to extend so much love and care for people, whether it's by wading through rubble barefoot to try to help people find survivors, whether it's little kids trying to put together scraps of meals to feed stray cats and dogs, whether it's the moms who get so profoundly creative in trying to put together a meal to nourish their families and the people they love. And that's just a testament to the love that they carry. And although what they're going through is not something that they should ever have had to go through, it just speaks so much to the type of people that they are. And that's something I'm always going to be so proud of. Like I'm so proud and grateful that I come from Gaza and that this is the legacy that I get to inherit.
I'm so happy you said that. And I think a lot of people who are listening to this probably have grown up or seen the narrative that paints Arab and Palestinians as hateful or angry. And what you just said has broken so many of these stereotypes,
Yeah.
because you're right. Palestinians are lovers. We want to love, we want to exist, we want to enjoy our life just
Absolutely.
like any other human being would. And just on that then, so were born in 1998 in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
and then your family decided to move to Canada.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through your journey? Why did your family decide to come here?
Yeah. So in 2005, Palestinians held their first elections in many years. And we know that at some point, obviously, the vote was in favor for Hamas, which was the party that was democratically elected in Gaza at the time. And that eventually led to Israel withdrawing all of its settlements from Gaza and rescinding control back to the Palestinian people. And so naturally, there was a lot of celebrations that came with that decision and that sort of announcement. But at the same time, usually when there's things like withdrawals or Israel taking a step back from something, it usually always leads to some form of collective punishment. And my parents at the time, they worked for an NGO. And so they had a lot of different contacts throughout the region about, what to expect for the future. And they started to quickly realize that it's time to start thinking about migrating to try to secure a better future for me, my sister, and my brother who came after. Um, it was a very difficult time for them. And I think just being 6 years old, I was quickly starting to realize that something big was about to happen and our lives were about to change. They started the process of immigrating to Canada. And that process takes about 6 months to a year. In that span of time, it was, I think, December of 2006 when they were like, okay, you know what? We just had our PR application approved. We're going to go to Canada over the winter holidays so that we can do our landing permit. And then we're going to come right back to Gaza so that I'd be able to finish third grade. And then we would move officially to Canada to the summer. And that was sort of the timeline that they had planned out. Now, to actually get out of Gaza, it was almost a week-long process because things started to become quite scary. Borders started to shut down. Rafah, the Egyptian Rafah crossing started to impose these quotas on how many people can leave every day, and they started to only prioritize urgent cases. We were going back and forth between our home and the border for probably 3 days straight, where it's just this never-ending waiting game of trying to see if we'd be able to get out. And it was starting to look really impossible. And there was an instant where someone who worked at the border, I guess, had compassion for, this family of four that was just trying to leave. And the way we actually got out was we were snuck into an ambulance where there was an old man who was comatose and he was being sent to Egypt for medical care and assistance. So he had no family with him. And so the border security officer decided that, you know what, no one would know any better. Just say you're this man's family and we'll be able to get you out that way. And that's how we were able to actually get out through the border on that day. And then from Egypt, we flew straight to Canada, did our landing permit. We only knew one family in the entire country at the time, and they happened to live in a small suburb in Ottawa. And so we were staying with them for about a week. My dad flew back to New York so that he could complete his master's that he was doing at the time. And so it's just me, my mom, and my little sister. And then there's this one morning, I remember waking up and going downstairs for breakfast, and I just see all the adults glued to the TV. And they were watching the news, and that's when we found out that the borders will be closed indefinitely. And so that started the 17-year-long blockade that's been suffocating Gaza ever since, with no real way of being able to go in and out with the security of knowing that you'd ever be able to actually return or get out again. And so we were essentially struck stranded. We had no way of going back home. It was a very, very, very difficult thing for me to process, realizing that I never really had a chance to say a proper goodbye to my friends, my family, the home that I grew up in, the streets that I was so used to and was familiar with. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in a very foreign place that we weren't prepared for, but we had no other choice. And then we just stayed in Canada ever since.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's thank you so much for sharing that. There's so many interesting points from what you just shared right now. One, the security guard in Egypt, him having that compassion,
Yep.
Probably, he broke some rules, but sometimes you have to
Yeah,
in our situation and for Palestinians because the laws and the systems are not in our favor. They're not humane to begin with.
I know.
The second thing I wanted to ask is when your family moved here, you
Mhm.
said there was a blockade for 17 years.
Yeah.
What does that blockade look like when you're in Canada? Does it mean that you cannot see your family in Gaza? Does it mean that you cannot visit them for those 17 years? Or what does that look like?
Um, it is, I mean, whenever I tell the story about the ambulance, which I don't share often, I always say that it's almost like taking an organ and trying to transplant it out of your own body. And that's what that experience felt like. To go back to your question, living here, being part of the diaspora, if you will, there's another aspect to it where you feel like you're in this constant state of exile because you live in a world where everyone can just hop on an airplane and just go places and visit the places that they originate from. You hear about people taking ancestry tests and realizing they're part Irish and then deciding they want to go explore their roots. For me, and I'm sure a lot of people resonate with this, it's a place I already know. It's a place I already lived in, and I breathe the air there. And it just feels so out of reach, yet so close to your own heart that it's like this constant paradox that you live with, where you just feel like it's something you carry with you everywhere, but it's not a place that you can actually physically be in. The blockade itself is incredibly devastating because what it does is that it stops people from having a choice. It makes you feel like if you were to leave Gaza, you probably can't ever go back again. And there's an aspect to a sacrifice like that that's incredibly sinister and tragic because anywhere that you're rooted, anywhere that you call home, you should always have the right to be able to return to it. Um, that blockade was not only detrimental for people who are in the diaspora who had to leave, but also for the people living there too. You start hearing these awful stories from your own family and friends and loved ones that have to recount how prices are so expensive for being able to secure food. It's hard to build homes because there's no infrastructure, there's no resources that are being imported, and the economy there had been crippled over those 17 years of sustained blockade because people were unable to export any of their products and goods and services. Things as simple as PayPal is non-existent in Gaza. The people in Gaza can't use things like PayPal, so even being able to work remotely was made incredibly inaccessible. You just it's really sad to even comprehend what that blockade is like because to give you context, like the Gaza Strip, I don't know how familiar you are with Canada's parks, but Gatineau Park, it's a pretty big park that we have very close to Ottawa. When I say pretty big, I mean, you have to kind of drive through it, but you're able to drive through it in just a couple of hours. That's the size of Gaza. It's such a tiny, tiny place that's sprawling with people, over 2 million people. And for them to not even have the ability to travel, to see the world outside the border lines that they're confined to be able to prosper, to make a life of their own, especially because we're very prideful as a people. It's very difficult for us to constantly feel like we're a charity case that always needs to depend on aid or people's support or charity. We want to be able to prosper and make lives for ourselves. And all those means were forcibly cut off through this blockade that they've had to endure.
Thank you for explaining that. And what I've gathered from your explanation right now is that one, this blockade
Mm-hmm.
impacted diaspora and impacted the people in Gaza.
Of course.
So it didn't give you that much access to your family back in Gaza, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, the economic and the political impact was so great. Like I can't imagine growing up and having dreams and knowing that I can't, let's say I set up a business, I can't export. If I wanted to work remote for, this company, I can't get paid via PayPal. And there's all these obstacles that you go through. The second thing you touched on, which is that feeling of growing up as a diaspora, as a Palestinian diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And you put it very beautifully, which is it's a very complicated feeling.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just dive into that a little more.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say the feeling of being a Palestinian diaspora is right now?
It's living with a lot of survivor's guilt and remorse every day because it's hard to look at what's happening back home and not separate yourself, knowing that if anything had gone differently in your story and timeline, if any person in your life connected to you made a different decision, that could be you. You could be there enduring all of that. And it's hard to sit here in so much safety and privilege and know that, the people back there, they're not better than me. They're not, it's not like they didn't have the same opportunities. We all come from the same place and we have all experienced the same thing. And they have to go through these horrors constantly. The things that we deem basic, they're basic human rights, basic privileges, to them are now a luxury that they only dream of. And for me, day by day, it's always just kind of this reminder of anytime I feel, you know, I guess consumed by what's happening in terms of obviously the devastation and wanting to make sure everyone that I know is okay. At the same time, it comes back to me in the sense of like, I wish I could switch places with anyone there. If I could, I would. It's hard to be here so far away and feel almost helpless, watching all those scenes unfold day after day, hearing about all the lives that are being taken, all the people who are living in the worst conditions imaginable, and knowing that somehow I'm sitting here and I've somehow ended up here and I don't have to go through that, but they do. So it's a lot of grief, it's a lot of guilt. Contending with it daily, I think, is probably universal feeling for a lot of other Palestinians in the diaspora as well. But I think that's been the biggest thing that's been permeating my constant thoughts with all of this.
Thank you for sharing. Survivor's guilt is very real, and I think a lot of people listening can relate to that feeling.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful what you said. And it is really quite disheartening to feel that we're now at a point where we'd want to be replaced or switch places with people who are suffering, because we've seen and we feel their suffering. We see it through our Instagram, through our social media, through TV. In your case, through having phone conversations and with your family members and friends back home. So thank you very much for sharing that. And now on the question of becoming better allies, because as we just are discovering right now, there is a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief that Palestinian diaspora and people who are impacted by what's happening, there's a lot of grief right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who want to become better allies.
Right.
The question I have for you is, how can we become better allies?
I think a common theme, or I guess question that comes up is, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. And whenever I hear that, I always think that that's such a defeatist mentality. I think that it's an imperial tool that's designed to isolate us and make us feel helpless. But everyone has so much power. And I think that's the first thing to start with, is that what you can do can probably save lives. And you might not think so, but it does. It inevitably does. Every little push, every little action makes a difference. So it starts with that. Overcoming that sense of hopelessness is really important. The second thing is to listen to Palestinians, centering Palestinian voices, leaning on Palestinian resources. We are the people who've endured this occupation for over 7 decades now. We know what our demands are. We are so well equipped with the context, with the information, with the resources that should be tapped into. So it's important to always make sure that folks are aligning themselves with Palestinians so that we're, achieving a higher unity and not scattering ourselves and dispersing our resources and our energy in the wrong places. At the end of the day, this struggle is a Palestinian struggle, and it does belong to everyone who cares and who understands what's at stake when it comes to what we're trying to achieve. But it's always important to not lose focus and just maintain that. And the third thing I would say is to always just remember to lean on the right language. I think growing up for me as a Palestinian here in Canada, I always had to contend with this feeling that, I didn't know what words to use or how to really describe what was happening because that language hadn't really set in. And I was also young, so it took some reading and educating. But now I'm immensely proud to see that we've gotten to a place where everyone is using the right words. You know, we're calling illegal settlements illegal settlements. We're calling the occupation a colonial project. We're using all the right terminology that's meant to address and essentially, what's the word here? Diagnose the symptoms of what's happening in Palestine. And the diagnosis is that we are under occupation by a colonial state that is an imperial project that is designed to ethnically cleanse us and subject us to most awful conditions in the hopes of displacing us and cleansing us from our own ancestral indigenous lands. So as long as we keep our focus on the right words, we lean on the right resources, and we continue to educate ourselves, that's really the best way that you can show up as an ally. Every little action helps, whether it's voting, emailing, calling, or showing up for direct actions to disrupt different systems or address politicians directly. Every little bit of pressure helps, and anything that anyone can contribute literally saves lives. So that would be my biggest advice.
Thank you very much for sharing that. So you mentioned using the right terminology, and you mentioned colonial state. I wanted to ask, what are some terms we should not be using? So for any allies who are listening to the podcast right now, to know like these are no-nos. And I'll start. Conflict. We do not call this a conflict.
It's not a conflict. It's not a conflict. It's a liberation struggle. I also recently started to realize that the word state itself isn't something that we should be giving power to, because Israel's not a state. It's a pseudo-state. It's an entity. It's an illegal occupation. And we all know that historically all occupations and colonial projects fall. So really focusing on the idea that your words have power and they do manifest in many material ways. So making sure that you're reducing power from, you know, the right entities and giving it back to where it belongs is really important. When we talk about, you know, the liberation of Palestine, for example, a lot of times people struggle with this idea of what, you know, that would look like, and they hesitate to say things like from the river to the sea. That's another thing that's really important to keep our focus on, is that we have to be aligned on what the demands of the Palestinians is. So those are kind of a few things. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much for sharing that. Yeah, from river to the sea, we see that very innocent term has been now manipulated. And when, you know, Netanyahu would say it, from river to the sea, Israel will be free. It's like, wow, this guy said something, but when we say it, it's problematic, and you know we're calling for things that are just not true. And then just on the question of allyship as well, we've discussed how to be a better ally, and we've discussed right now the different words and terminology that we should use and we shouldn't use. Now, what are some things that allies should not be doing?
Allies should not be. I think the biggest thing is, and I mentioned this before, is this idea of achieving higher unity. I think a lot of people come in to our struggle and our movement with the best of intentions, but oftentimes it leads to a lot of, you know, scattering different energies, joining different groups, trying to do their own initiatives. And there's nothing wrong with that. If anything, like, we welcome all efforts that folks want to invest. But the biggest thing is to always just try to make sure that, one, we're holding our community members accountable, and two, that we're working towards unifying our communities rather than dividing them. And the other thing that I would say is to also make sure that you listen to the people from back home, because oftentimes we get kind of caught up in the noise all the way here, and we forget that the most important voices that we should always constantly platform are the voices of the Palestinians back home, who are risking their lives in order to speak up and share their stories and tell us what's happening. So that's one. The other thing that I think allies should prioritize and think about is that when they're educating themselves about the struggle, about the Palestinian struggle, they also have to make sure that they're centering resistance in all the ways that resistance shows up. It's really important that they learn what it means when we say resistance, and also unlearn a lot of the different biases and stereotypes and restrictive ideas that they've been taught growing up in the West, so that they can understand, when we talk about what it takes to liberate our homeland and what it means to defend ourselves and protect our dignities and our people, that they approach it from a manner that's cognizant of sort of the nuances that they were taught to be wary of or scared of. So that would be my other piece.
Very well said. I appreciate the fact that you keep emphasizing centering Palestinian voices, the Palestinian voices on the ground, and I couldn't have said it better myself, because we do see a lot of times, as well intentioned as it may be, some people can come up and start taking space from those Palestinian voices and may center themselves, whereas celebrity culture has died, whereas this is not about you using this as clout to become an influencer to sell different things. It's about the liberation of Palestinians. And how do we liberate Palestinians? We need to start amplifying their voices and creating space for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been really hard to see in the last 6 months now how folks have capitalized on the momentum that Palestine's been receiving and trying to build their own platforms for their own personal gain off the backs of obviously all the empathy and sympathy that the Palestinian cause is receiving. I think that, as shameful as it is, I always want to try to give grace to folks to remember that, what brought you to this, what brought you to this struggle or this cause in the first place. If it's your empathy, then utilize your empathy to center yourself again about where you stand. You have the rest of your life to take every opportunity to grow yourself, to build a platform. But right now, this second, this moment has to be utilized in favor of the people whose literal lives are at stake. And if you can take that space and make sure you're giving it, you're honoring the space that you're able to create with your platforms or your resources by allowing others to use it in favor of the greater good, this is the time to do that. It's not the time to try to build off of fame and excess, because it really dishonors the integrity of what this entire struggle is about and what it's meant for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now we talked about Palestinian voices, we talked about allyship, and we see the world is waking up. We're seeing a lot of people, especially, I would say, started off with people of color, anyone who basically had the experience of coming from a country where it has been colonized,
Yeah.
where they felt the struggle, they felt the same pains that we have. And then it started becoming a global movement. And in the words of Irish politicians, in the thousands, in the millions, we're all Palestinians. But there are still people who are pro-Israeli.
Yeah.
And when I say the word pro-Israeli, I mean people who are still trying to justify the genocide of what's happening right now on the ground in Gaza.
Yep.
And some of them, Deborah Messing,
Yeah.
Amy Schumer, the list can go on, all these celebrities, but also regular people. What do you want to tell pro-Israelis like Deborah Messing, Amy Schumer, Chelsea Handler, and the list can go on, who are still trying to justify the genocide that's happening in Gaza?
I think with individuals like that, there's really no point in engaging in any sort of discussion. If there is ever any ounce of energy that I can give to characters like that, all I feel is pity. I feel really sorry for them that they've reached a level where they're so brainwashed and immersed in propaganda that they've fully become incapable of humanizing other people. And I think it just comes down to humanization. The fact that they're able to platform lies and propaganda in favor of an entity that's only harming not only Palestinians, but also the very people that they claim to protect, because they're constantly putting them in danger. They're constantly trying to convince them that the world is out to get them. And so I can only feel sorry for them, but I feel like individuals like that are not really worth engaging with at all. For any folks that have had to grow up their entire lives being taught to, I guess, play for the other side, the only thing that I can say is that if they're ever brave enough to step out of their own echo chambers, there are endless, countless resources that are readily available that they can tap into to see the truth for themselves. But that takes a turning point within themselves to be able to reach that level, to just acknowledge that everything that they've learned is essentially a lie. And it's a lie that's designed to manipulate them so that they can be pawns in a bigger game that's only just all about power, you know, pushing forward imperial agendas and just feeding into the war machine. And again, that just goes back to just really feeling sorry about for people like that. I really just have nothing else to say beyond that.
Well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I do agree that there are people that are so brainwashed,
Mm-hmm.
and there is really no hope for them. And we've seen even like some TikTok allegations of other comedians. I think his name is like Michael Raparoy. I can't even pronounce his last name,
Yeah.
where it was seen that he was getting paid to say things about Israel.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing is I don't know even how genuine those conversations that they're having with their audience is. But at the same time, what you mentioned, which is there are people who are starting to question and unlearn and relearn. And those are the people that we want to put our energy on. And
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you said, if you are listening to this and you're questioning, it's like, where do I stand on the subject? There are countless resources out there.
Yeah,
And there are so many people on the ground and academics that they can follow and learn more about the subject.
for sure. I think that as much as, people say that victors, are the ones that get to write history, I think that history offers a lot of lies, but it also offers a lot of truths. And it didn't take much for me to learn a lot about the history of how Israel came to be and what its original, I guess, foundational roots were. And a lot of it has to do with colonialism. A lot of it has to do with collaborating with the Nazi regime. A lot of it has to do with really perpetuating a sense of fear for all Jews of the world to feel like they can only be safe in one teeny tiny patch of land in the center of the Middle East. When, you know, I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of the people, but I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that everyone has a right to feel free and safe anywhere they choose to make home. And so there's a lot of context that anyone can dive into, but it all just starts with that intention of wanting to set out on that path because I'm sure it can be very scary. Unlearning is a very difficult process, but it's definitely a noble one. And I only hope for, um, I hope for a moment in time where as many people as possible can reach that stage because they will be received with such warm, open arms. I think our community and our struggle is, in spite of it being, tragic and difficult, and we have a long road ahead of us, it's also a beautiful one. And it's full of camaraderie and hope and love and unity. And we want the prosperity that we have to be something that we can share with everyone else from all corners of the world.
Thank you for sharing that. As you said, it might be a difficult journey, but it is an honorable one.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for saying that and for putting it so eloquently. Now, as we're discussing, as we're discussing people and their journeys,
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back in time a couple of months ago and go back to your journey, which is you made a speech
Yeah.
at a press conference in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
It went super viral,
Yeah.
and you said a couple of things in that speech that I just want to take the opportunity to dive a little deeper.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
All right. So, in your speech, you said, and I quote,
Mm-hmm.
"Not a moment goes by that I do not have to contend with the grief and guilt with my privileged position, including my family, does not know if they will wake up tomorrow."
Yeah. Um, that line was something that I feel like I had to center what I was saying back to kind of that point in the middle of the speech that I was writing. It was also a very last minute thing that I was putting together the night of. I didn't know I was doing it until probably 10 hours before the actual press conference. And I was feeling a lot of things because I recognized that I was stepping into the proverbial belly of the beast, being on Parliament Hill and standing before, these stoic politicians who are often very emotionless when you're speaking to them. And so, in trying to wrap my head around like what I could possibly say, I think it was really important for me to tap into what I was feeling at that point in time, being 3 weeks into that genocide and being so far away from my home and being here. It is a privileged position to live here. And I mentioned this earlier, but I attach so much guilt and remorse in being so far away and feeling almost helpless, knowing that any day I could wake up and just hear the bad news that I've lost more family members or more loved ones, or that the neighborhood I've been to has been flattened, or the places that I used to have the most beautiful childhood memories, the parks I used to go to, the beaches I used to swim in, have all been destroyed or, occupied. So that's where that line came from. It was just to, I think, remind anyone who is listening that I'm not just here to speak to a situation that's far away. It's something that has an immediate direct impact on me, and the same on so many other Palestinians who are having to sit all the way here trying their best to try to protect their families or bring them back here or make sure that they're okay, and pressuring the government and their communities to support them in doing just that. It's not easy. It never gets easier.
Thank you for saying that. And absolutely, like even while you're talking, I could feel the grief and I can feel the pain. And I wanted to just ask and first of all check in, like how are you feeling right now? It's been a few months.
Um, how am I feeling? I mean, all I can say is Alhamdulillah. Um, I know that so many people have it so much worse. I think that's also the difficult part is you can feel so much, but at the end of the day, what they're going through will always be so much more difficult. Um, I've been leaning a lot on my support system, and my support system looks like a mosaic of friends from near and far, my family that I'm so grateful to have close to me, and folks that I honestly just meet by chance at different actions or events for Palestine, because that compassion and love and care has really fueled me and helped me kind of center myself in the past few months, because it's helped me recognize that our work doesn't stop, and grief can definitely feel like it's going to crush me from the weight of it, but um, there's always going to be work to do, and I can't really help anyone if I give in to that. I definitely have my days where I have to kind of withdraw and grieve, um, but I can only say that I'm just very grateful for the people who've been there for me, and that's really what's been holding me down. So
That's beautiful. Emotional support systems are so so
so
important.
important.
And
Yeah.
that was actually going to be my follow-up question is what advice would you like to give to someone
Mhm.
who might feel that sense of grief watching the news unfold in Gaza?
Step aside, step outside, take in your surroundings and ground yourselves with the reality that you're in. Acknowledging how you're feeling is also really important, because sometimes we feel a lot of things that we don't really have a name for. So sitting with those feelings and just trying to retrace their sources and kind of understand where they're coming from. And then make sure that you're surrounded by people who love you. I know that sounds a little cliche, but it's really the folks who care for you that are going to fill your cup. And as much as the situation might feel helpless and hopeless, it isn't. And we've been a people that have been occupied for over almost 8 decades, almost 80 years now. Um, we've survived 80 years. We can survive so much more, and we will survive it. So lean on those who care for you. Try to stay grounded in reality, and remember that again, you really can't help anyone if you can't help yourself. So try to start there.
Love that. Love that. So more on the self-care side
Mhm.
and reach out if you need any help and be surrounded by love and people who support you as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, taking care of yourself doesn't have to also necessarily mean like taking a step back from what's happening. bearing witness is a huge, huge responsibility. And it's also a privilege to be able to be so far away, and, you know, your only window into what's happening is to witness what's going on. But self-care also means taking what you're seeing and finding a way to be more efficient or productive with those feelings that you're experiencing, and putting them in a place that can, one, either alleviate that weight you're feeling, and then two, also feel like it's helping others, because it's kind of like a snowball effect. You take a feeling, you turn it into intention, you start something small, and it's always going to have a butterfly effect that'll cascade into either bringing others together or inspiring an action, or directing some sort of initiative that's going to help others, even if that's just also, even if that looks like just creating space for people to come together too.
I'm glad you clarified that, because when we do think of the word self-care, the first thing that pops in our mind is to detach.
Yeah.
Whereas what you're saying is that it is our responsibility to bear witness. Self-care can look like bearing witness and making sure that we're present, that we are staying active, but there are things that we can do to take care of ourselves, our well-being, while we're still proactive.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, the first period, I really found myself isolating a lot and just being absolutely enraged and sad and feeling really, really helpless. And I realized that in engaging in a lot of protests and direct actions, I was able to get a lot of that emotion out, and being able to just show up and march with your community and be there together to grieve together is something that's really powerful. So there's definitely a lot of ways that someone can take all the different emotions they're feeling and turn it into something that expands on solidarity and community care.
Thank you for sharing that, Farah. And I want to now just go into the next quote in your speech. So this was one of my favorite quotes, and it really did resonate a lot. To quote you again, you wrote, "Families have been instinct. If I can write all their names on my body, my skin will drown in ink." What made you write that in your speech?
You know, it's crazy because you're not the only person who has found that line to really resonate. And when I wrote it, I had no idea that it would hit home for so many folks that would be listening. When I wrote it, it was really just a reflection of having to have process all the different videos and images that we were seeing, where families were showing that they were writing their kids' names and their family names on, you know, their bodies and their limbs. Um, and, you know, at first you think, well, why would someone do that? Why would they, you know, why would, say, a father write, you know, their kids' names on their kids' arms or legs? And it's because things had gotten to a point where families were being bombed in the middle of the night, and the horrific aftermath usually always meant that limbs were torn apart and bodies were shredded. And so families and parents were making this decision that they wanted their kids to be at least identified, so that they could be honored when they're buried, and that they wouldn't be forgotten. So they would write their names on their kids' skin. And I remember when I first, you know, heard that this is what was happening, it was such a heavy feeling to sit with, because you start to think about how many thousands of names belong to thousands of people that just perished. They're full of lives and stories and ambitions and histories, and they're gone just like that, and all they have left is their name. So in the moment of writing that speech, I really wanted to honor our martyrs in a way that reflected the amount of loss that we've had experienced as Palestinians up until that point. And so what I wrote was just a literal reflection of that, is that if I could write all of their names on my skin, it would drown in ink. There wouldn't be an inch of my body that wouldn't be covered in ink and trying to capture their names. And that was that, really.
Wow. That is quite sad, unfortunately, to imagine the number of people that have died since October.
Yeah.
And honestly, since 1948,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, the past few months have been horrific.
Yeah.
But it's this ongoing struggle, this ongoing ethnic cleansing, genocide, and this thought for parents where they have to just put mark their kids' name on their limbs just to honor them. That, like, I can't imagine anyone living a life like that. And when we humanize them and remember that they have their own life stories, these kids could have grown up and did so much good in the world.
Yep.
Maybe then the politicians will feel a little bit more empathy. And that's going to be my next question to you. Is you wrote this speech a few months ago to politicians at a press conference. What is the message you want to tell politicians today about what's happening in Gaza?
I think at this point in time, the only thing I can say is thank you for showing your true colors. I think there's always never been really a doubt about the fact that oftentimes politicians will rarely, choose people. They'll always choose power. They'll always choose profit over the will of the people. And that's always been a theme. And especially in Canada, we have to always be aware of the fact that we live on colonized, stolen Indigenous land. And to this day, the Indigenous people of Canada across the country are always facing persecution. They're always facing the worst, possible system that's meant to repress them and oppress them and take even more land from them. So I think that when it came to speaking to the politicians that day, whether they heard me or not, I was very aware of the fact that it will probably fall on deaf ears. What I have to say today is that, I always grew up thinking that politicians were meant to be these leaders that are meant to champion the best of humanity and push it forward, and that they're meant to deal with, corruption and the evils of the world and try to push people over to, the light. And as I got older, I got very disenchanted. But to honor the little version of me who used to believe that, the only thing I have to say is that, I'd like to think that these politicians were also once kids that wanted to grow up and leave their mark on this world and have a legacy. And I just pray to God that they wake up one day and realize that history is not going to be kind to them, and that the liberation of Palestine is inevitable. And when we write the history books, it will not be kind to them. And we will never forget nor forgive the mark that they've had in continuing to perpetuate this genocide that we see, not just in Palestine, but also in the Congo. We see it, with all sorts of folks in the global south that are enduring so much oppression and so much violence and damage to their integrity as a people. So that's something that is a weight that doesn't just leave once they've resigned and retired. It's something that they'll always taint their legacy and their mark on this world. And I hope that they realize that one day and hopefully choose to be on the better side of history before it's too late.
Wow. I really hope that the politicians are listening to this and taking notes. And if people are interested in getting into politics, to remember that as well, to remember why you're entering into politics. And I know I told you this off the call, but I do hope there is some future in politics for you, Farah. But that we can discuss on another episode.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we do need people who are courageous enough to enter the realm of politics and actually want to make a change, and not just feel afraid and be silent or overlook what's actually happening just to try to win some votes.
Definitely.
Or even worse yet, only start calling for a ceasefire when an election is happening.
Yeah, that's been the common theme lately, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, whether there's a future for me in politics or not, I always say this: my identity as a Palestinian makes me political. So I'll always feel like I'm submerged in that world, regardless of whether I want to or not. But we'll see. We'll see how the future unfolds.
Well said. Yeah, well, us calling ourselves Palestinian, the first thing, it's a political statement.
Political statement.
Political statement.
Yeah, for sure.
But I will say this, and I think I told you this before, is that I'm very grateful that now in the world, at least when I say I'm Palestinian, people know what Palestinian is. Because growing up, calling myself Palestinian, everyone assumed I was from Pakistan.
Yeah.
So to see that discourse and to see the that people are waking up, at least we're moving in the right direction.
We're moving the right direction. Absolutely. I know. Growing up for me, it was almost the opposite reaction because I would never shut up about Palestine.
Love it.
So anytime someone would ask, "Oh, where are you from?" everyone would just start going like, "Oh no, like here we go. We're about to get into it." And I took that, like to boot. I was like, yeah, like this is who I am. I'm going to bring my identity into every space that I get into. And whether you know something or nothing at all, like you're going to get a crash course by the time we're done. So,
Right on,
yeah.
as you should.
No, it's definitely beautiful to see this shift. I have younger siblings and, they're just getting through high school and second year university. So they're in that environment where they're meeting a lot of different people. And obviously they're very proud of where they come from. And they definitely have it a lot easier than our generation, I would have to say, just because they tell me stories about how they shared their Palestinian and they're immediately embraced and, people are eager to learn and ask questions. Whereas before, I think the amount of ignorance and, lack of context always led to people saying, "Oh, you mean Pakistan?" Which I
Yeah.
know.
And it's an interesting point you mentioned about the generation,
Mm.
because even with, let's say, my parents' generation, for example,
Yeah.
them calling themselves Palestinian, there's a level of fear,
Yeah.
right? Because
True.
for them, growing up saying they're Palestinian meant that there was a lot of negative implications. It could mean, translates to maybe being stateless.
Hmm.
They would prefer to try to downplay that
Hmm.
when it comes to the immigration process. So every generation hopefully is going to get better and better until Palestine is free.
Until Palestine is free, and we're so close,
And we're
inshallah.
so close.
Yeah.
And on that note, I wanted to ask and conclude with this one question.
Hmm.
What does a free Palestine look like for you?
That's a big question. um, a free Palestine to me is once again from the river to the sea. It looks like our prisoners being freed, our lands being reclaimed, our people returning back to their lands and their homes, the ability to rebuild our towns, our villages, our cities, to open up our borders with our sister nations, with Lebanon, with Syria, with Jordan, have that ability to move again, to breathe again, to eat from our harvest, and to also create a government that is for us and by us and no one else. And from there, find a path towards justice and not only just reclamation, but also retribution for what's happened, because we've had to endure the greatest cost of loss over and over for many generations. And I don't think there's anyone in the world that can really account for the type of loss that the Palestinians have endured, not just on a material level or even a physical level with our, lives, but also our mental state, our, ability to see the world beyond the violence and destruction that we've had to endure for so long. So a free Palestine to me looks like a lot of work, but it looks like a beautiful place. And I can't wait to be able to return one day and invite all my loved ones to come to a free, liberated Palestine and see what all the big fuss is about. Because, what we fight for, what we strive for is something bigger than all of us. And it's worth fighting for.
Beautifully said. And it is worth fighting for. And I love the fact that you mentioned that retribution aspect, because we do tend to forget that.
Mm-hmm.
And we see it a lot in different communities, like we see it with the indigenous people as well, where a lot of these atrocities happen and then they want to repay them back. And then they want to try to make up for what has happened. Whereas, we can just prevent these things.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for and again, an eloquent answer, and for coming today on Yellow Let's Talk. You discussed a lot of different topics today. You told us about your story about growing up in Gaza and how it was like for you to be a diaspora in Canada. So you went from Gaza to diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about allyship and what does allyship look like and what it shouldn't look like. And then we dived into what message we want to tell anyone who might be quote unquote still pro-Israeli and still trying to justify what's happening in Gaza right now. And then we concluded this conversation going back to your speech that you said in a press conference in Ottawa, where it was so beautifully put together. And I didn't know it was only a couple hours that you had to write that down. So, like, fantastic job, and thank you for continuing to make a difference in the world and for continuing to speak about Palestine. And on that note, I want to leave the mic to you to tell the audience where they can find you, and if you have any last message you want to share as well.
For sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me and for giving me the space to share my story and where I stand. Um, Folks can find me online. My username is a bit corny. It's Farah Qaddan. It just combines my name Farah with Palestinian. Um, and I always say that at the end of the day, I'm a Palestinian, and what I do is the least that I can do. I'm no one special. I'm not the most qualified person. I'm not looking for people to turn to me or look to me for guidance on what they can do in order to support our struggle. There are countless voices and people out there who have long created the systems and the resources for people to inform themselves and direct themselves towards the right actions. I do my best to do just that. And all I can hope for everyone is to continue to learn, to equip themselves with the right knowledge and the tools in order to not just secure the liberation for the Palestinians, but the liberation for everyone else in the world. All of our prosperities and freedoms are intertwined, and there's no struggle without intersecting with other struggles, and we all have to lean on ourselves in order to push ourselves towards a better future for us and for all the generations that are going to follow.
Love that. And thank you for sharing that, because collective liberation is the way to go. As my sweater, courtesy of Slow Factory.
On theme.
Yeah, on theme for today's conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Farah, for joining us today. And for anyone who is listening right now, if you enjoyed this episode, please do not forget to subscribe. Please give us a 5 stars. If you didn't like it, then just, pass it along. But on that note, we hope you enjoyed the episode. Yalla, bye.